Several civil society organizations have said Finance Minister Enoch Godongwane's midterm budget policy statement, which he delivered last week, left a lot to be desired. The organizations say while they welcome the increased spend on education, school nutrition programs and the extension of the 350 social relief of distress grants, they say the extension alone may not be enough. With the current inflation peak, the cost of living, food and basic necessities is far too insurmountable. Let's speak more on this with the Executive Director of Staying Alive Foundation. I beg your pardon, it Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute Executive Director. That's Isobel Frye. Isobel, you can tell I haven't had my coffee yet. Hey, good morning to you and thank you very much for joining us. So a welcome move, you believe, by the Finance Minister, especially with the social grants are concerned, but you believe somewhere, somehow, they're robbing the poor to pay the poor. Why?
Good morning, Dudu, and I do hope you get your coffee soon on a Sunday morning. That's what we all need. I think that the MTBPS kind of leaves one of the similar state of confusion, because we know in South Africa that we are in the grips of an ever-deepening crisis, that the levels of unemployment from youth unemployment at 72% to general unemployment of just under 45% is completely dysfunctional. We are an outlier on any kind of measure globally, and we're deeply unequal in terms of both incomes as well as wealth. And yet the MTBPS signals no explicit attempt to deal with that. So as you said, although nominal increases have been noted, if you look at both the fact, as you mentioned, the incredibly high food inflation of between 11 and 12%, the increase in fuel, as well as the fact that we have a growing population of about 1.3. In fact, government allocations have contracted in real terms by 1.7% in this allocation. Now, we know from the research that we've done, but it's also a global fact, that private sector investment follows state investment. And if you see what really amounts to the state reducing its investment, our incredibly miserable growth predictions, which are constantly being downscaled and now hover between 1.7 and 1.9% for the 2022, become even weaker. So we have a situation where government and the private sector are saying we can only address people's poverty and look at addressing basic needs if we have growth. And yet the very actor, National Treasury, that has the ability to welcome private sector investment to grow the growth, is the one that's saying we're not going to be doing that. So it's as if there is a kind of a schizophrenia at the heart of the nerve center of the policy that we need to be having leading us. And Dudu, I mean, what's also strange for us is that the MTBPS signals what's going to happen in February next year. And that's a pre-election budget. You would imagine that the pre-election budget would be going out to woo voters, and the majority of South Africans, the majority of voters, are living in poverty. But this seems to not bear any reference to people's realities.
A two-pronged question. Maybe let me start with this. What is the unintended consequence of this? Because you've also got people who are left out of this, right? You've noted that only 7.4 million of the previous just under 12 million people are in receipt of the 350 Rand grant. So if people cannot afford themselves, what is the unintended consequence?
The unintended consequence is a growing detachment of the majority of people from the nation. We pride ourselves at being the rainbow nation, the miracle nation, but as you so rightly say, 12.4 million people are officially unemployed in South Africa. That excludes people who are neither in employment or in training, and it also excludes people who are categorically employed in the informal economy. But that's 12.4 million people who view themselves as completely alienated from society, from the economy. Now, the social relief of distress grant, many of us saw as a welcome step towards recognizing the need for a universal basic income grant. a kind of embrace of everybody into this boat, saying that we're in it together. What Treasury did, strangely, again, completely without any comprehension as to what it was going to lead to, was in February of this year, there was an announcement that the Social Relief of Distress Grant would continue for another 12 months. And yet the following 3 months was spent on trying to put up a whole lot of conditions to exclude people who'd previously been receiving the 350 grant from receiving it. And in fact, DSD announced a 2 billion rand underspend in the Social Relief of Distress Grant in this MTBPS accounting. So the most vulnerable people are not able to get the assistance that they need. The unintended consequences are just an ever-increasing alienation, and we know that people who have nothing to lose are the ones who most easily caught up in populist rhetoric. The fear that many people have expressed is as we go towards the next election, the depth and the scale and magnitude of violence will become increasingly obvious as people feel that the only way that they are seen or heard is when they express themselves through violence.
Sure.
But Dudu, just to come in, I mean, I was sort of just looking at the impact on people, but the other great concern that we have is the less that you invest in the economy, the more the economy contracts. So a self-fulfilling prophecy is if we are not investing in the economy now, the outer years on the budget are going to become greater and greater crisis. So the Social Relief of Distress Grant, which you mentioned, although it's been extended year on year begrudgingly, it hasn't kept pace with inflation. So from this year going forward, the 350 rand has actually lost 14% of its value. So retailers are not being able to sell as much because people don't have money to buy. So people employed in supermarkets are being reduced, or any other kind of retailer. And so you can see that there's a spin-off in every sector of the economy, because what we're effectively saying is we're not growing this economy.
You know, Isobel, so you talk of the populist rhetoric, and you speak of our contracting economy and we're not investing in the economy. Then you have the second part of the question, right, where there are some sectors of society that believe that, well, this is not sustainable. We cannot create a dependency on the Social Relief Distress Grant. What then do you say to those people, right, who then also back that up by saying, things are changing so rapidly. Maybe it will reach South Africa in, 10, 20 years, but you won't have packers at the till anymore when you go to whatever shop you go to. So how do we then understand that in the context of what you have just explained in terms of the unintended consequence?
I think you've just articulated the real challenge that we have going forward, because the world of work is changing. Fewer and fewer of the lowest skilled jobs that absorbed many of the people from a sort of apartheid period into our new democracy are being done away with globally. So the deficit, the job deficit that we had, is growing even more. We know that the return on education, if you look at the unemployment statistics, we have a very few number of unemployed graduates compared to general unemployed people, where matric and grade 10 are where people stop growing their skills. But the question of dependency, I think, is an interesting throwback to the sense of the fact that people who are unemployed through their own fault, because I am thoroughly dependent on my salary every month. If I didn't get my salary, I wouldn't be able to continue to contain my household, my bond, food, anything. So to say that grants create dependency amongst the poor, I think is going about it the wrong way. We're all dependent on income. We've moved away from the sense of that peasantry where we feed our needs from the land. We don't do that. So the question is, how is society creating those income streams? And if it's not coming through employment, which is the traditional way for the last 200 years, then we need to be admitting that we need to be looking at new ways of distributing income. And that's really why I think social grants, which came into being really strongly after the Second World War when Europe had to reconstruct itself. So grants have been really the primary tool for developmental states, because that's effectively what Europe was. And we look at people like Elon Musk and other billionaires who see a future of fourth industrial revolution where the basic income grant features heavily. So we both stuck in the past of saying we want full employment, and we're fearful of going forward, which is to say that's not happening. So let's create the new society while we still can, while we can bring people back into the mainstream and activate the kind of economic agency that each of us need in order to keep the economy producing through the demand that we have. People can't create demand if they have no disposable income. And in fact, to liberate that potential that people have through the new ways of distributing, through social grants, is the way that we can save this country from going into a complete meltdown, which is sadly where we're headed. Because each year we have matriculants coming out from school into the labour market again with very, very little chance or hope of getting decent employment. We see retailers posting large profits, and yet if you go to most supermarkets, even in the suburbs, the people at the tills and the packers don't have permanent jobs. They don't have a pension. They don't have the ability to buy their house, to send their kids to sort of tertiary training or university. We have a society where instead of the mobility going upwards, the mobility is actually declining, and we don't see any ways or intention to interrupt that and to say we've never built the foundations of a new society since 1994. We've inherited a strangulating economy where labor is extracted without value going back into households. And we need to stop and really seriously think about how we start going forward. We need to tackle the wealth that we have in the inequality in this country. We need to look at, for instance, the invested funds that we have, the government employee pension fund, the unemployment insurance fund. We're not a poor country, but we seem to be reluctant to unlock the wealth in order to move us onto a better growth trajectory, which would then start the positive cycles, and we're just really shrinking.
Scary stuff. We're not a poor country, indeed. Thank you very much for your contribution, Executive Director of the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, Isobel Frye.